Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the fourth Sunday after Pentecost, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for the fourth Sunday after Pentecost are 2 Kings 5, 1 through 14, Psalm 30, Galatians 6, 1 through 16, and Luke 10, 1 through 24. Today, we're going to talk about Elisha the Prophet. You might remember Elisha if you checked out the readings from last week, as Elisha was there when his mentor Elijah was taken up into heaven. I'm going to combine a bunch of different readings together to talk about him today, so I'm halfway ignoring today's assigned readings, except as the prompt to talk about who Elisha is and what Elisha does. But first we'll start with the guy with a similar name, who Elisha is connected with, Elijah. Elijah was a prophet in the 9th century BCE who lived during the time of King Ahab. The Hebrew scriptures paint Ahab as bad, and Elijah's first appearance is prophesying a drought because of Ahab's badness. Elijah, after prophesying this, flees Israel and lives in Zarephath in modern-day Lebanon for a time. And after 3 or so years, Elijah goes back to Israel, has a sacrifice battle with the prophets of Baal, which Elijah and the God of Israel win, and then, with rain restored to the land, flees into the wilderness again, where God tells him to, among other things, anoint Elisha to succeed him as prophet. This all happens around the reading from 1 Kings 2 weeks ago. Elisha then starts following Elijah around. Some other things happen, but then Elijah is taken up into heaven. And in the process, Elisha inherits a double portion of Elijah's spirit, the inheritance of a firstborn. This might refer to God's spirit. It's not entirely clear in the text whether it's meaning Elijah, the person's spirit, or the spirit that was resting on Elijah, meaning God's spirit, but it's not also entirely relevant. What is relevant is that Elisha then takes up Elijah's mantle, both literally and figuratively, grabbing Elijah's cloak and becoming God's prophet in Israel, taking Elijah's office as well. The next several chapters have various stories that show Elisha in his new role. He purifies a spring that contaminated the land and left it infertile. But then he goes and curses 42 kids who called him bald, and then those 42 kids get mauled by 2 she-bears. This is a story that has some disagreement in it on what it's really going on. Some commentators see it as a sign that Elisha is still learning how to appropriately use this power from God that he has. Others, like in one of the versions of the Hebrew scriptures, a translation by Robert Alter that I have shares, the early rabbis were so outraged by this story that they felt constrained to assert that it never really happened. A Hebrew idiom even came out of this event, neither forest nor bears, meaning a complete falsehood, as those rabbis would argue that there were neither forest nor bears around the town of Bethel, where this event supposedly happened. Nonetheless, Elisha continues to proclaim the words of God and perform various miracles, some quite similar to ones that Elijah did before him, mostly to the people of Israel. But then comes the scene from today's reading with Naaman, the Aramean general. Naaman was an enemy of Israel. There's no way around that. He's at the head of the Aramean army, winning great victories because, according to the writer of 2 Kings, the name the God of Israel granted him those victories. But Naaman had some manner of disfiguring skin disease, perhaps vitiligo, and he wasn't all that happy about it. One day, an Israelite girl whom Naaman had captured and enslaved suggested that Naaman go to Israel and see the prophet Elisha. Naaman mentions this to his boss, the king of Aram, who wrote a letter to the king of Israel, who rightly panicked because he thought that Naaman's situation was going to be used as a pretext for war. But then Elisha heard about what was happening and told Naaman to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman protests the simplicity of the healing and the insignificance of the Jordan River, but is convinced, dips himself in the Jordan, and is healed. In the process, he decides that the God of Israel is worthy of his worship, and he takes some land from Israel with him so that he can worship the name when he goes back to Aram, which is in modern-day Syria. The taking of the land thing is because in those days, gods were rather intrinsically linked to a land that was their domain. So Naaman felt that he would have needed some of the dirt of Israel with him if he was to go and worship Israel's God. There's some interesting modern theories about the importance of land for worshiping a god, but I have a lot more reading to do before I really want to talk too much about that. Naaman also asks for a really interesting dispensation about basically having to worship in the temple of his, well, now old god, because of his service to the king of Aram. It's a really educational moment about how to exist in a pluralistic world, but I'm not actually going to talk about that today either. After the scene with Naaman, Elisha continues to serve as Israel's prophet for something like 60 years, continuing to do all sorts of miracles before he dies in 2 Kings 13. Even in death, Elisha continues to work miracles, as when someone who died was flung into Elisha's grave a year later, somewhat ironically because the Arameans were raiding Israel at that time, they came back to life again. Elisha has this fascinating story that begins in immaturity with the curse he lays on the 42 youths for calling him bald, and ends with him being a well-respected and powerful prophet of the name, even posthumously raising someone from the dead. I think that's an important story to pay attention to, as it reminds us that even in Scripture, especially in Scripture, people are sometimes just jerk faces. But we can get better. We say and do inappropriate things, but we also learn from those things and grow into the kind of human who we're supposed to be. The kind of human who lives lives that help and not hurt. Kind of like Elisha did. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo just below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.